Sir, please step back and let us finish. They are my parents. Please treat them with respect. Who are you?
Sir, step out of the vehicle and keep your hands where we can see them. The command cut through the quiet afternoon like a cold wind, and for a heartbeat, every conversation in the grocery store parking lot seemed to disappear. Harold Brooks, 74 years old with silver hair neatly combed beneath a faded navy baseball cap, blinked through the windshield of his aging blue sedan. Beside him, his wife Evelyn adjusted the cardigan around her shoulders, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as she looked at the two patrol cars that had boxed them in from the front and rear. They had done nothing more exciting that day than pick up heart medication, a loaf of wheat bread, and a bouquet of yellow daisies Evelyn insisted made the kitchen feel brighter. Yet now flashing lights reflected across the hood of their car, painting ordinary errands with an uneasiness neither of them understood. Officer Ethan Collins stepped forward with practiced confidence, one hand resting near his duty belt, his expression unreadable beneath mirrored sunglasses. His younger partner, Officer Ryan Foster, remained several feet behind, quietly scanning the growing crowd as shoppers slowed their pace, grocery carts squeaking over faded asphalt while curious eyes drifted toward the scene. Someone lifted a phone. Another whispered something that neither Harold nor Evelyn could hear. Harold lowered his window halfway and offered the same calm smile that had carried him through 4 decades as a public school history teacher. "Officer, is there a problem?" Collins didn't return the smile. "License and registration." Harold reached carefully toward the glove compartment, moving exactly as instructed, every motion slow and deliberate. Evelyn rested one hand lightly on his forearm. "Take your time," she whispered, more to reassure herself than anyone else. Collins watched every movement without speaking. Foster glanced toward the prescription bag resting on the passenger seat, then back toward Harold's weathered face. A breeze carried the scent of fresh rain mixed with gasoline and hot pavement. Somewhere across the lot, a shopping cart rolled freely until it bumped against a curb with a hollow metallic click. The ordinary sounds of the afternoon suddenly felt distant, almost unreal. Harold handed over the documents with steady hands. Collins studied them briefly before looking back into the car. "Both of you step outside." Evelyn looked confused. "Officer, my knees aren't what they used to be." "Is there some reason, ma'am?" Collins interrupted evenly. "Please step out of the vehicle." Harold opened his door first, careful not to move too quickly. He walked around to help Evelyn as she slowly eased herself onto the pavement. Her sneakers touched the ground with visible caution, and she leaned gently against the door for balance. Around them, more people had stopped to watch. A delivery driver remained beside his truck. 2 teenagers whispered while pretending not to stare. Phones continued recording. Harold noticed them and quietly looked away. He had spent his entire career teaching students that dignity often meant staying calm when life wasn't. Today, he silently hoped that lessons still mattered. Collins asked another series of questions, his tone measured but firm. Where had they been? Where were they headed? How long had they owned the vehicle? Harold answered each one politely, never raising his voice. Evelyn clutched her purse against her chest, her eyes drifting toward the bouquet of daisies still resting inside the back seat. One of the flowers had slipped free and lay across the fabric upholstery, bright against the faded blue cloth. Across the parking lot, a large man carrying 2 paper grocery bags stopped walking. He had been heading toward a pickup truck parked 3 rows away, but the flashing lights caught his attention immediately. His eyes narrowed as recognition settled over his face. Without saying a word, Marcus Brooks changed direction and started walking calmly toward the gathering crowd, never taking his eyes off the elderly couple standing beside the old sedan. Before we continue, if you enjoy powerful stories that reveal the strength of the human spirit and the choices that shape our lives, subscribe to Narralight. Every story has a lesson, every choice has a consequence, and sometimes the smallest moment changes everything. Now, let's see what happens next. Marcus Brooks did not run. He did not shout. He simply walked with the steady pace of a man who understood that panic only made tense moments heavier. The 2 paper grocery bags rested comfortably in his hands, one filled with fresh vegetables, the other carrying canned soup, bottled water, and the sugar-free cookies his mother secretly loved despite insisting she only bought them for guests. As he moved closer, He immediately recognized his father's worn blue sedan, the bouquet of yellow daisies resting inside, and the familiar gray cardigan draped over his mother's shoulders. Then he saw the flashing lights surrounding them. His jaw tightened, but nothing about his face revealed anger. Years of discipline had taught him that emotions could wait. Observation always came first. Around him, the crowd continued to grow. Phones remained pointed toward the elderly couple, while quiet conversations floated through the humid afternoon air. Some people assumed something serious had happened. Others simply wanted to witness whatever came next. Marcus noticed every camera, every face, every possible witness without appearing to study any of them. Harold looked up first. Relief flickered across his weathered face the instant he recognized his son. Evelyn smiled softly despite the worry clouding her eyes. She knew Marcus had only stopped for groceries after finishing another long week away from home. She had no idea he would walk into this. Marcus stopped several feet away, careful to remain calm. "Dad, Mom, is everything all right?" Harold answered before either officer could speak. "We are fine, son. Just a misunderstanding, I hope." Marcus nodded once. "Good. That is good." Officer Collins stepped between Marcus and the couple with quiet confidence. "Sir, stay where you are." Marcus remained exactly where he stood. "Of course, officer. I only wanted to make sure my parents are all right." Collins glanced briefly at the grocery bags before looking Marcus up and down. His broad shoulders stretched against a plain charcoal sweatshirt, and his larger build made him appear imposing even though his posture remained completely relaxed. Collins folded his arms. "These people are your parents?" "Yes, sir." "Then you can wait over there while we finish." Marcus lowered both grocery bags onto the pavement with deliberate care, making sure the eggs stayed upright. "I understand. May I ask if they are being accused of something?" Collins did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Foster, who quietly checked something on the patrol car computer. Foster frowned slightly, then looked back toward Collins as though uncertain. Collins ignored the expression. "That does not concern you." Marcus accepted the answer without argument. "I respect your job. I only ask that my parents are comfortable while this gets sorted out." Evelyn shifted her weight carefully. Harold noticed and gently offered his arm for support. Marcus watched the small gesture and forced himself to stay still. He knew his mother's arthritis became worse whenever she stood too long. The afternoon sun reflected from the windshield, making her squint. She had never liked bright light after her eye surgery the previous spring. Marcus almost stepped forward to help her move into the shade, but he stopped himself. Every decision mattered now. Across the parking lot, a little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Why are those people in trouble?" The mother hesitated before quietly answering. "I do not know, sweetheart." Marcus heard every word. So did Harold. He lowered his eyes for a brief moment, not because he felt guilty, but because he understood how quickly strangers created stories without knowing any facts. Foster walked back from the patrol car holding a small notepad. His voice was quieter than Collins. "Sir, I cannot find anything unusual so far." Collins answered without taking his eyes off Marcus. "Keep checking." Marcus remained motionless, hands visible, breathing evenly as another patrol vehicle slowly turned into the parking lot. Something inside the atmosphere shifted. Even the people recording seemed to sense that this ordinary afternoon was becoming something none of them had expected. The third patrol vehicle rolled to a quiet stop near the edge of the parking lot, but no one stepped out immediately. The engine idled beneath the warm afternoon sun, while the blue reflections from the emergency lights continued to dance across nearby windshields. Marcus glanced toward the vehicle for only a second before returning his attention to his parents. His father still stood with remarkable composure, one arm supporting Evelyn as she shifted her weight to ease the pressure on her aching knees. The bouquet of yellow daisies remained untouched inside the sedan, almost glowing through the rear window like a small reminder that this day had begun with something as simple as kindness. Officer Collins watched Marcus carefully. There was something about the man's calmness that refused to fit the situation. Most people became defensive, impatient, or emotional when family members were questioned in public. Marcus had done none of those things. His breathing remained slow. His shoulders stayed relaxed. Even his eyes moved with quiet purpose instead of panic. Collins interpreted the composure differently. To him, it looked rehearsed. "You seem unusually comfortable," Collins finally said. Marcus answered politely. I believe staying calm helps everyone. Collins gave a faint smile that never reached his eyes. That depends on what someone is trying to hide. Several people in the crowd exchanged uncertain glances. A middle-aged woman carrying reusable shopping bags frowned slightly, as though the conversation no longer sounded as straightforward as she first assumed. Another man lowered his phone for a moment, then quietly lifted it again. Foster returned from the patrol car holding a tablet instead of the notepad. He leaned toward Collins and spoke quietly enough that the crowd could not hear every word. Marcus caught only fragments. Vehicle registered, nothing outstanding, medical appointments confirmed. Collins nodded once without responding. He looked back at Harold. Where exactly were you before coming here? Harold answered without hesitation. St. and Medical Center. My wife had a follow-up appointment with her cardiologist. We picked up her prescriptions afterward. Evelyn slowly lifted the pharmacy bag. The printed receipt was still folded neatly inside. Collins glanced at it, but did not ask to see it. Marcus remained silent. Every instinct told him the situation should already be ending, yet something kept pushing it forward. That bothered him more than anything else. Across the parking lot, the automatic doors of the grocery store slid open again. Employees stepped outside pretending to collect shopping carts, but their attention remained fixed on the gathering. Even the cashier who had greeted Marcus less than 10 minutes earlier now stood near the entrance with visible concern. Foster cleared his throat. Sir, perhaps we should verify everything with dispatch one more time. Collins answered without looking away from Marcus. We will. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice measured and respectful. Officer, may I ask one favor? Collins folded his arms. Depends. Marcus nodded toward Evelyn. My mother has difficulty standing for long periods. If there is no immediate concern, would it be possible for her to sit inside the car while you finish? Collins studied him for several long seconds. The request itself was reasonable. The tone was calm. There was no challenge hidden inside the words. Yet something about Marcus continued to make him uneasy, as though he were speaking to someone who understood far more than he appeared to. Before Collins could answer, Evelyn gently touched Harold's sleeve. I am all right, she whispered. Do not worry about me. Marcus offered her a reassuring smile that lasted only a moment. Then he quietly picked up one of the grocery bags before remembering he had been told to stay where he was. He immediately placed it back on the pavement without protest. That tiny act did not go unnoticed. Foster watched it carefully. Most people under pressure forgot instructions. Marcus remembered every single one. The silence stretched across the parking lot until even the distant sound of traffic seemed to fade. Somewhere overhead, a flock of birds crossed the bright afternoon sky. Collins looked once more at the tablet in Foster's hands, then back at Marcus, and for the first time since the encounter began, uncertainty flickered across his face, faint enough that only someone paying very close attention would have noticed it. Officer Ethan Collins let the silence linger just long enough for everyone to feel it. Then he took one slow step toward Marcus, his polished boots scraping lightly against the faded parking lot stripes. You know, he said, tilting his head slightly, most people get nervous during situations like this. Marcus met his eyes without hesitation. Everyone responds differently. Collins gave a short laugh that sounded more skeptical than amused. Apparently, he looked Marcus up and down once more, lingering for a brief second on the charcoal sweatshirt stretched across his broad frame. You seem pretty confident for someone who just walked into the middle of a police investigation. Marcus answered with the same calm tone he had maintained from the beginning. Confidence and respect are not opposites, officer. Several people standing nearby exchanged quiet glances. The sentence was simple, yet it carried no challenge, no sarcasm, only quiet certainty. Collins folded his arms. You have an answer for everything, do you? Marcus smiled politely. No, sir. Just the questions that are asked. Foster shifted uncomfortably beside the patrol car. Something about the conversation felt different now. The facts they had gathered did not match the tension still hanging over the scene. Dispatch had confirmed the vehicle registration. The medical appointment checked out. The prescription information matched the receipt Harold carried. Piece by piece, every ordinary explanation had proven exactly that, ordinary. Yet Collins continued watching Marcus instead of closing the encounter. Harold cleared his throat softly. Officer, if there has been some misunderstanding, perhaps we can help clear it up. Collins glanced toward him but did not answer immediately. Evelyn quietly adjusted the sleeve of her cardigan. The afternoon heat had begun to fade beneath slow-moving clouds, and a gentle breeze stirred the bouquet of daisies visible through the rear window. Their bright yellow petals fluttered almost imperceptibly, adding a strange softness to the otherwise tense parking lot. Marcus noticed his mother rub one hand against the other. He knew that movement well. She always did it whenever she felt anxious but wanted to hide it from everyone else. His father noticed it too. Harold gently squeezed her hand without saying a word. 48 years of marriage had taught them entire conversations could happen in silence. Collins looked back toward Marcus. "Let me give you some advice." Marcus nodded respectfully. "I am listening. Stay out of police business unless someone asks for your opinion." Marcus accepted the words with a slight nod. "That is fair advice." Collins seemed almost disappointed by the lack of resistance. He had expected irritation, perhaps even an argument. Instead, every response remained measured and composed. Behind them, another shopper whispered quietly, "That man has been nothing but polite." Someone else answered, "I know. I do not understand why this is still happening." Foster heard both comments. He glanced toward the crowd before lowering his voice. "Sir," he said carefully to Collins, "people are recording everything." Collins answered without looking away from Marcus. "They are free to record." Marcus finally spoke again, still keeping his hands visible at his sides. "Officer, I appreciate that everyone has a difficult job to do. I only hope this can end in a way that lets my parents finish their afternoon peacefully." Collins stared at him for several seconds. There was no fear in Marcus's expression. There was no attempt to impress anyone watching. More than anything else, there was patience. It was the kind of patience usually found in someone who had spent years learning that every unnecessary word could make a difficult situation worse. Foster's radio crackled softly. He listened for a moment before his eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. "Dispatch has another update," he said. Collins extended his hand without turning around. "Go ahead." Foster hesitated, looking first at the small screen in his hand, then at Marcus, then back toward Collins. Whatever he had just received did not match what he expected to hear. Even before he spoke, Marcus noticed the young officer's posture change. It was subtle, almost invisible to everyone else, but experience had taught Marcus to recognize the exact moment certainty began giving way to doubt. Officer Ryan Foster lowered the radio from his shoulder, but did not speak immediately. The hesitation alone caught everyone's attention. His eyes remained fixed on the small screen in his hand, as though he were reading the same message twice, hoping it would somehow change. Officer Ethan Collins extended his hand again. "Well," Foster inhaled slowly before answering. "Dispatch confirmed the medical appointment, the pharmacy pickup, and the vehicle information again. Everything checks out." Collins frowned. "That is all." Foster hesitated once more. "There is one additional note." Collins turned toward him. "Go ahead." Foster glanced briefly at Marcus before returning his attention to Collins. "Dispatch said to document the encounter carefully because someone from the regional office requested a copy if this incident generates a public complaint." Collins gave a dismissive shrug. "That is routine." Foster nodded, although something in his expression suggested he was not entirely convinced. Around them, more people had gathered beneath the cloudy afternoon sky. A teenager quietly whispered, "I have been recording since they first stopped the car." His friend answered, "Me too." Several others lowered their phones only long enough to switch from photographs to video before raising them again. Marcus noticed every movement without appearing to watch anyone. His attention remained centered on his parents. Evelyn's breathing had become slightly heavier, not alarming, but enough for Marcus to recognize the familiar signs of fatigue. She had always tried to hide discomfort from those around her. Harold gently rubbed the back of her hand, speaking softly enough that only she could hear. Marcus could not make out the words, but he recognized the reassuring smile his father wore. It was the same calm expression Harold had carried through decades of teaching teenagers who often arrived in his classroom angry at the world and left believing patience still mattered. Marcus finally spoke again. "Officer, may I ask one more question?" Collins looked directly at him. "One." Marcus nodded appreciatively. "Has anyone explained to my parents why they were stopped?" Collins answered evenly. "We are still conducting our inquiry." Marcus accepted the answer with another small nod. "Thank you." He said nothing else. The silence that followed stretched across the parking lot. Even Collins seemed to expect another question, another argument, or at least a complaint. None came. Instead, Marcus bent slightly and adjusted one of the grocery bags so the paper handles would not tear beneath the weight of the canned food. He remained exactly where he had been instructed to stand. Foster quietly watched him. Every action reflected restraint rather than frustration. It was unusual. Collins folded his arms once more. Most people in your position would be demanding answers by now. Marcus looked at him calmly. Sometimes answers come faster when everyone remains respectful. Collins studied him with growing curiosity. You always talk like this. Marcus smiled faintly. My father spent 40 years teaching history. My mother taught me kindness. Those lessons stay with a person. Harold lowered his eyes for a moment, visibly moved by hearing those words. Evelyn smiled despite the tension surrounding them. Nearby, the little girl who had asked why the elderly couple was in trouble looked up at her mother again. They do not seem scary. Her mother quietly replied, No, sweetheart, they do not. Foster's radio crackled again. This time the sound was sharper, followed by a brief burst of static. He answered immediately, listened without interrupting, then slowly looked toward the entrance of the parking lot. In the distance, several dark sport utility vehicles turned onto the access road. They moved together at a steady speed without flashing lights or sirens, blending almost unnoticed with the afternoon traffic. Most people ignored them. Marcus did not. His eyes followed the approaching vehicles for only an instant before returning to his parents. Nothing about his expression changed, but somewhere deep inside, he knew the quiet balance holding the afternoon together was about to shift in a way no one standing in that parking lot could yet imagine. The line of dark sport utility vehicles continued toward the shopping center with quiet precision, blending into ordinary traffic so naturally that almost no one paid attention. Marcus noticed them only because he had trained himself to notice details other people dismissed. He looked away almost immediately, refusing to let his eyes linger long enough for anyone else to wonder why. His focus remained exactly where it had been since arriving, on his parents. Evelyn shifted again, her shoulders rising with a slow breath as she leaned more heavily against Harold's arm. Marcus recognized the subtle signs of exhaustion that came after long medical appointments. She was trying her best to appear stronger than she felt. Harold quietly smiled at her. Almost home, he whispered. She returned the smile, although neither of them knew how much longer they would remain standing in the parking lot. Officer Ryan Foster watched the exchange with growing discomfort. Nothing about the elderly couple suggested danger. They looked like countless grandparents he had seen shopping with handwritten grocery lists tucked into shirt pockets and reusable bags folded neatly beneath car seats. He cleared his throat before speaking to Collins again. Sir, perhaps we should let Mrs. Brooks sit down while we finish documenting everything. Collins remained silent for a few seconds. His eyes drifted toward Evelyn before returning to Marcus. She says she is fine. Marcus answered gently before either of his parents could respond. She always says that. Evelyn gave her son a look somewhere between affection and mild embarrassment. Marcus. He smiled softly. Mom, you taught me honesty. Even Foster smiled for the first time since the encounter began. Collins did not. He continued studying Marcus with quiet suspicion, as though waiting for the calm exterior to crack. Instead, Marcus remained exactly the same. Respectful, patient, completely composed. The breeze carried the faint scent of fresh bread from the grocery store bakery, mixing strangely with warm asphalt and gasoline. Shopping carts rattled across the pavement, while automatic doors opened and closed behind customers trying not to stare, but staring anyway. The parking lot had become strangely quiet despite the growing crowd. People lowered their voices without realizing it, sensing that something important was unfolding even if they could not explain why. Foster's attention shifted toward the approaching sport utility vehicles. They had entered the outer edge of the parking lot now, moving steadily without urgency. No emergency lights flashed. No horns sounded. Their tinted windows reflected only gray clouds drifting overhead. Collins followed Foster's gaze briefly before dismissing it. Probably another agency passing through. Foster nodded, although uncertainty remained in his expression. Marcus said nothing. Harold finally looked toward Collins. Officer, may I ask you something? Collins answered with a restrained nod. Go ahead. Harold spoke with the calm confidence of a man who had spent decades standing in front of classrooms. Do you believe respect becomes less important simply because someone is old? Colin seemed caught off guard by the question. No. Harold smiled gently. Good. I spent 40 years telling young people that character shows most clearly during ordinary moments, not extraordinary ones. Collins offered no reply. The words settled into the silence between them. Even several people standing nearby lowered their phones slightly as they listened. Marcus looked at his father with quiet pride. Some lessons never stopped teaching. Evelyn reached into her purse and carefully removed a small bottle of water. Her hands trembled just enough that Marcus noticed immediately. Without stepping forward, he asked softly, "Would you like me to hold that for you?" She smiled. "I have it." Foster noticed the exchange as well. Every concern Marcus expressed centered on his parents, never himself. It was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile that behavior with the suspicion that had prolonged the encounter. Then Foster's radio came alive once more, but this time the voice speaking through the speaker was lower, sharper, and unmistakably more urgent. Foster listened for several seconds without interrupting. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He slowly lowered the radio and looked toward the nearest dark sport utility vehicle, which had just come to a smooth stop less than 50 feet away. The driver's door opened quietly, and a man in a dark suit stepped onto the pavement, scanning the parking lot with calm, deliberate eyes before fixing his attention on only one person standing among the crowd. The man who stepped out of the dark sport utility vehicle did not hurry. His charcoal suit fit neatly beneath a lightweight jacket, and his polished shoes made almost no sound as he crossed the parking lot. He did not look at the flashing patrol lights. He did not glance toward the growing crowd. Instead, his eyes settled briefly on Marcus, then moved away again as though acknowledging something without drawing attention to it. Marcus recognized him immediately, but showed no sign of recognition. His expression remained calm, his hands resting naturally at his sides. The suited man stopped near the second vehicle, speaking quietly into a small microphone clipped beneath his lapel before another two men exited the remaining vehicles. None of them displayed badges. None of them interrupted the scene. They simply observed. Officer Ryan Foster noticed them first. "Sir," he said quietly, "those people have been watching us since they arrived." Collins gave only a quick glance. "They can wait like everyone else." Foster nodded, although his uncertainty continued to grow. There was something familiar about the disciplined posture of the newcomers. They were not curious bystanders. They were professionals, comfortable with waiting, comfortable with silence. Marcus shifted his attention back to Evelyn. "Mom, are you getting cold?" She smiled softly. "Just a little breeze." Harold removed his light windbreaker and carefully draped it across her shoulders. "Better." Evelyn squeezed his hand. "Much." Watching them, several people in the crowd quietly lowered their phones. The scene no longer felt like strangers being questioned. It felt like a family trying to finish an ordinary day that refused to become ordinary again. Collins finally spoke. "Mr. Brooks." Harold looked up. "Yes, officer." "How often does your son visit?" Harold smiled proudly. "Whenever work allows." Collins turned toward Marcus. "What kind of work keeps you that busy?" The question floated in the warm afternoon air. Several people instinctively looked toward Marcus, expecting a detailed explanation. Instead, Marcus answered with complete simplicity. "Public service." Collins raised an eyebrow. "That is pretty vague." Marcus nodded. "Sometimes it has to be." Collins folded his arms once again. "Government." Marcus offered a polite smile. "Yes, sir." "State." Marcus paused for only a heartbeat. "Federal." Foster's eyes shifted toward Marcus with renewed curiosity. Collins studied him carefully. "Doing what?" Marcus remained respectful. "I am not at liberty to discuss my assignments." Collins gave a faint, skeptical laugh. "That sounds convenient." Marcus accepted the remark without offense. "I understand why it might." Harold quietly looked toward his son. He knew Marcus well enough to recognize the careful wording. His son had answered honestly without revealing anything more than he was permitted to say. That alone told Harold the situation was becoming far more delicate than anyone around them realized. The suited man near the vehicles subtly checked his watch before speaking quietly to another colleague. None of them approached. None of them interfered. Yet every few seconds their attention returned to Marcus. Foster noticed it again. This time he could not ignore it. He leaned closer to Collins. "Sir, I think those men know him. Collins barely glanced over. Then they can introduce themselves if they want. Before Foster could respond, the little girl standing beside her mother pointed toward the dark vehicles. Mom, those people all dressed the same. Her mother answered softly. Yes, they did. Marcus heard the exchange, but kept his eyes on Evelyn, who had finally taken a sip from her bottle of water. Relief washed quietly across his face. His greatest concern had never been himself. It had always been making sure his parents reached home safely. Then the man in the charcoal suit reached inside his jacket, removed a phone, listened for only a few seconds, and looked directly at Marcus once again. This time, instead of remaining where he was, he gave the smallest respectful nod before taking his first deliberate step toward the center of the parking lot. And Foster suddenly realized the afternoon was about to change in a way none of the bystanders could have imagined. The suited man crossed the final stretch of pavement without the slightest hint of urgency. Every step was measured, every movement controlled, as though he understood that rushing would only make the moment heavier. The other two men remained near the dark sport utility vehicles, quietly observing the parking lot while speaking into nearly invisible earpieces. They did not interfere. They simply watched. Officer Ethan Collins shifted his stance as the stranger approached. "Can I help you?" he asked evenly. The man offered a courteous nod before reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. Several people in the crowd instinctively leaned forward. Phones lifted a little higher. Foster quietly took half a step closer, unsure what to expect. The man removed a simple leather credential holder and opened it just enough for Collins to read. Collins looked down. His expression remained firm for barely a second before something changed behind his eyes. It was not fear. It was recognition. He read the identification again more carefully. "Good afternoon," the man said calmly. "Special Agent Daniel Mercer." Collins looked back up. "Federal Bureau of Investigation?" Mercer nodded once. "Yes." Foster felt his stomach tighten. Collins quickly composed himself. "Is there a problem, Agent Mercer?" Mercer answered politely. "Not necessarily. We received notification that an interaction involving one of our personnel's immediate family members might be attracting public attention. We are here only to observe and ensure everyone's safety." Collins frowned slightly. "One of your personnel?" Mercer turned his head only a fraction, his eyes resting briefly on Marcus before returning to Collins. "That is correct." The words seemed to freeze the afternoon. Even the breeze that had carried the scent of fresh bread across the parking lot felt strangely absent. A teenager holding his phone whispered, "Did he just say Federal Bureau of Investigation?" Someone beside him quietly answered, "I think he did." Foster slowly looked toward Marcus again. The calm posture, the careful words, the complete absence of panic. Suddenly, every small detail began fitting together in a way that made perfect sense. Collins followed Foster's gaze toward Marcus, then back toward Mercer. "You are telling me." Mercer interrupted gently before Collins finished the sentence. "I am not here to interfere with your investigation, officer. I simply ask that professional courtesy be extended while the facts continue to be established." Marcus remained exactly where he had been standing the entire time. He did not step forward. He did not acknowledge Mercer beyond a slight nod of mutual respect. His attention remained on Evelyn, who quietly adjusted Harold's windbreaker around her shoulders. Harold noticed Mercer for the first time and immediately understood why Marcus had remained so composed. His son had not called anyone. He had not threatened anyone. Whatever was happening had unfolded through entirely different channels. Collins looked back at Marcus with an expression that no longer carried the same certainty. "You work with him?" he finally asked. Marcus answered honestly, "Yes, sir." "Why did you not say that from the beginning?" Marcus smiled gently. "Because today was never supposed to be about me." The answer settled over the parking lot with surprising weight. Several people quietly lowered their phones, no longer interested in capturing confrontation. They were watching character instead. Mercer folded the credential holder and slipped it back into his jacket. Agent Brooks has followed every instruction given to him since arriving. He has remained respectful throughout this encounter. I appreciate that professionalism has been maintained on all sides. Foster lowered his eyes briefly. Collins said nothing. For the first time since the flashing lights had appeared, the balance of authority had shifted without a single raised voice. And yet Marcus still stood beside two grocery bags, focused not on status, but on making sure his elderly parents could finally go home. Before we continue, if you enjoy inspiring stories about courage, second chances, and people who choose kindness when it matters most, subscribe to Narralight. Our stories remind us that one decision, one voice, or one act of compassion can change a life forever. Now, let's see what happened next. For several long seconds, no one moved. The flashing patrol lights still reflected across the blue sedan, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Officer Ethan Collins looked from Special Agent Daniel Mercer to Marcus Brooks, then back again, as though trying to reconcile the quiet man carrying groceries with the federal agent standing patiently beside his elderly parents. The crowd sensed the shift immediately. Conversations that had filled the edges of the parking lot faded into whispers. Even the people still recording lowered their phones slightly, no longer searching for conflict, but waiting to see what character would look like when everyone finally understood the truth. Collins cleared his throat. "Agent Brooks," he said carefully, speaking the title for the first time, "why did you not identify yourself immediately?" Marcus answered with the same steady voice he had used from the beginning. "Because my parents deserve to be treated with respect before anyone knew what I did for a living." The sentence landed quietly, yet it carried more weight than anything spoken that afternoon. Foster looked down for a moment. He remembered every request Marcus had made. None of them had been about authority. None had been about privilege. Every single one had been about Evelyn finding a place to sit, Harold being treated with dignity, and allowing two elderly people to finish an ordinary afternoon. Mercer remained silent, allowing Marcus to speak for himself. That choice did not go unnoticed. Harold gently adjusted the windbreaker around Evelyn's shoulders before smiling proudly at his son. "Your mother always said a title tells people what you do," he said softly, "but your character tells them who you are." Evelyn reached over and squeezed Marcus's hand for the first time since he had arrived. "You listened." Marcus smiled. "I learned from both of you." Collins slowly removed his sunglasses. Without them, the confidence that had defined his expression earlier gave way to reflection. He looked toward the prescription bag still resting on the hood of the sedan, the bouquet of yellow daisies visible through the back window, and the two grocery bags Marcus had carefully protected throughout the encounter. None of those details had seemed important before. Now they suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Foster quietly stepped closer to Collins. "Sir," he said in a voice meant only for his partner, "everything we verified pointed in the same direction from the beginning." Collins gave a slow nod, but did not answer immediately. Across the parking lot, the little girl who had been watching with her mother smiled when she saw Evelyn finally relax her shoulders. "I think they are going home now," she whispered. Her mother smiled gently. "I hope so." Mercer finally spoke again. "Officer Collins, no one here wishes to make this more difficult than it already is. My colleagues and I are simply documenting the circumstances, just as you are." Collins nodded respectfully. "Understood." He looked toward Marcus once more. "Agent Brooks, I appreciate the way you handled yourself today." Marcus answered without hesitation. "Thank you, officer. I appreciate that you are willing to keep looking at the facts." Foster glanced toward the crowd. The atmosphere had changed from curiosity to quiet reflection. A few people stopped recording entirely. Others slipped their phones back into their pockets. They had expected an argument, perhaps even an angry confrontation. Instead, they had witnessed restraint, patience, and a family refusing to let tension erase their dignity. Mercer checked his watch briefly before looking toward Marcus. There was no spoken instruction, only a subtle understanding shared between two professionals. Marcus recognized it immediately, but remained exactly where he was. His parents still came first. Until Harold and Evelyn were free to leave, nothing else mattered. Collins drew a slow breath, looked once around the parking lot, and seemed to reach a decision that would shape everything that followed. Officer Ethan Collins slowly exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders one careful breath at a time. He looked around the parking lot as if seeing it for the first time. The flashing patrol lights, the scattered grocery carts, the families standing quietly beside their vehicles, and the dozens of phones that had recorded every minute of the encounter suddenly carried a different meaning. This was no longer simply another call during an ordinary shift. It had become a lesson that would remain long after everyone drove away. Collins stepped toward Harold Brooks and Evelyn Brooks. His voice was quieter than before, stripped of the certainty that had filled it at the beginning of the afternoon. Mr. Brooks, Mrs. Brooks, based on everything we have confirmed, you are free to continue your day. I apologize for the length of this stop. Harold smiled with the same calm grace he had shown since the first flashing light appeared behind his car. Thank you, officer. Evelyn nodded warmly. We appreciate that. Neither of them raised their voices. Neither of them spoke with bitterness. Their kindness seemed almost unexpected after everything that had happened. Collins turned toward Marcus. Agent Brooks, I owe you an apology as well. Marcus shook his head gently before Collins could continue. What matters most is that my parents are able to go home safely. Collins looked surprised. You are not upset? Marcus smiled faintly. Being upset would not improve today. The answer lingered in the quiet afternoon air. Foster stood nearby holding his tablet, but no longer writing anything. He looked toward Marcus with unmistakable respect. Sir, Foster said carefully, I do not think I have ever seen someone stay that calm under this much attention. Marcus looked at him. Calm gives people the opportunity to make better decisions. Foster nodded slowly. He knew he would remember those words for a long time. Special Agent Daniel Mercer remained several feet away, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. His colleagues continued observing without interruption. There was no dramatic intervention, no display of authority, only patient professionalism. Mercer finally stepped forward. Officer Collins, if you require any information from our office concerning today's documentation, you may contact me directly. He handed Collins a business card. Collins accepted it respectfully with both hands. Thank you, Agent Mercer. The two men exchanged a brief nod built not on rank, but on mutual professionalism. Around them, the crowd slowly began to disperse. One by one, shoppers returned to their errands. The teenager who had recorded nearly the entire encounter lowered his phone and quietly said to his friend, That man never once tried to use his badge. His friend answered, Maybe that is why it means something. Nearby, the little girl waved shyly at Evelyn. Evelyn smiled and waved back, the simple gesture carrying more warmth than any speech could have offered. Marcus bent down and lifted the 2 grocery bags from the pavement. He checked the eggs first, smiling quietly when he saw they were still intact. Harold chuckled softly. You protected the groceries better than I protected the flowers. Marcus looked through the rear window where the yellow daisies still rested on the back seat. Mom would never let us forget those flowers. Evelyn laughed for the first time that afternoon, and the sound immediately softened every remaining trace of tension. Collins watched the family together for a moment before speaking once more. Agent Brooks. Marcus turned. Collins hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Thank you for reminding me that respect should never depend on knowing who someone is. Marcus held his gaze and answered with quiet sincerity. Every person deserves the benefit of dignity before they have to earn anything else. Collins slowly nodded. There was nothing left to add. The flashing lights were switched off one by one, leaving only the gentle afternoon sunlight reflecting across the blue sedan as the parking lot finally returned to the ordinary rhythm it had carried before the first patrol car ever arrived. Marcus opened the passenger door first, carefully placing the grocery bags on the floor before turning back toward his parents. Take your time, he said gently. Harold helped Evelyn settle comfortably into the seat before walking around to the driver's side. The simple routine carried the quiet rhythm of a family that had cared for one another through countless ordinary days. There was no celebration, no dramatic relief, only gratitude that the afternoon was finally beginning to return to normal. As Marcus closed the passenger door, he noticed Officer Ryan Foster approaching at an unhurried pace. Foster removed his cap for a moment, holding it respectfully in both hands. Agent Brooks, he said, may I ask you something before you leave? Marcus nodded. Of course. Foster looked briefly toward Harold and Evelyn, then back at Marcus. When you realized this situation might become complicated, why did you never mention your position? Marcus rested one hand lightly on the roof of the sedan, thinking for a moment before answering. Because if my parents deserved kindness only after someone discovered who their son was, then the kindness would not have been genuine. Foster remained silent. Marcus continued. Every person you meet has a story you cannot see. Some wear expensive suits. Some wear work boots. Some drive luxury cars. Others drive an old sedan because it still gets them where they need to go. None of those things should determine how they are treated. Foster slowly nodded, the words settling deeply within him. I understand. Marcus smiled gently. I hope so. Good officers change lives in ways they rarely realize. Nearby, Officer Ethan Collins stood quietly beside his patrol vehicle. He had not intended to overhear the conversation, yet every word reached him clearly across the now peaceful parking lot. For the first time in many years, he found himself replaying the encounter from beginning to end. He remembered Harold's patience, Evelyn's quiet dignity, Marcus's steady voice, and the countless opportunities when a little more empathy could have shortened the entire afternoon. Special Agent Daniel Mercer approached Marcus one final time. Everything is ready, he said quietly. Marcus nodded. Thank you for keeping your distance. Mercer smiled. You handled it exactly the way I expected you would. Marcus chuckled softly. My parents were watching. Harold, now seated behind the steering wheel, lowered the window. He still worries about disappointing us. Evelyn laughed warmly from the passenger seat. That part never changes. Even Collins found himself smiling. The tension that had dominated the parking lot only minutes earlier had disappeared completely. The shoppers who remained no longer stared. They simply returned to loading groceries, returning shopping carts, and helping children into car seats. Ordinary life had quietly resumed. Foster extended his hand toward Marcus. Thank you for your patience today. Marcus shook it firmly. Thank you for listening. Collins walked over a moment later. Mr. Brooks, he said, looking toward Harold. Mrs. Brooks, I hope the rest of your day is much quieter than this one. Harold smiled. Every difficult day teaches something. The question is whether we choose to learn it. Collins nodded thoughtfully. I believe I will remember that. Marcus picked up the bouquet of yellow daisies from the back seat and handed it carefully to his mother. Evelyn smiled as though she had almost forgotten about them. She gently touched one of the bright petals before looking out the open window. These flowers still look beautiful, she said. Marcus smiled. Some things survive difficult afternoons better than we expect. Harold started the engine, its familiar hum filling the quiet space around the old sedan. Before shifting into drive, he looked at his son through the open window. Are you coming home for dinner? Marcus glanced toward Mercer, who answered with a knowing smile before Marcus even spoke. We can finish paperwork tomorrow. Marcus laughed softly. Then I would not miss dinner for anything. Harold smiled with unmistakable pride, and as the old sedan slowly pulled away beneath the soft afternoon light, the yellow daisies resting safely in Evelyn's lap seemed to brighten the entire car, reminding everyone who watched that dignity, once protected, has a remarkable way of blooming long after the hardest moments have passed. The drive to Harold and Evelyn's house took less than 15 minutes, yet none of them felt any need to fill the silence. The old blue sedan rolled through familiar neighborhoods lined with maple trees whose leaves stirred gently beneath the late afternoon breeze. Marcus followed behind in his pickup truck, keeping a comfortable distance, watching the same car he had watched disappear down the driveway hundreds of times throughout his life. It suddenly looked smaller than he remembered. Perhaps it was because his parents had grown older, or perhaps because he had finally realized how easily an ordinary day could become something unforgettable. When they reached the modest brick home where Marcus had grown up, Harold parked beneath the shade of an old oak tree that had stood there longer than Marcus had been alive. The porch swing creaked softly as the breeze passed through the yard, and the small flower beds Evelyn had tended for years still bloomed, with quiet determination despite the summer heat. Marcus carried the grocery bags inside while Harold insisted on taking the lighter bag containing the bread and fruit. I may be retired, Harold said with a smile, but I have not forgotten how to carry groceries. Evelyn laughed warmly. He has been saying that for 20 years. Inside, the house smelled exactly the way Marcus remembered. Fresh coffee, polished wood, and the faint scent of cinnamon from the candle his mother always lit after coming home. Nothing about the house reflected wealth or prestige. Family photographs covered one wall from floor to ceiling. School portraits, graduation pictures, birthday parties, fishing trips, and one faded photograph of a much younger Marcus standing proudly beside Harold after winning his first community spelling bee. Mercer arrived a few minutes later carrying nothing more than a folder tucked beneath his arm. Harold greeted him at the door as though welcoming an old family friend rather than a senior federal agent. You came just in time, Harold said. Coffee. Mercer smiled. I would never refuse your coffee. Soon the four of them gathered around the small oak dining table that had hosted decades of birthdays, holidays, difficult conversations, and ordinary family dinners. Marcus poured fresh coffee into four mismatched mugs while Evelyn arranged the yellow daisies in a simple glass vase at the center of the table. The flowers immediately brightened the room. Mercer finally opened the folder. "There will be an administrative review of today's encounter," he said calmly. "That is standard procedure whenever public documentation exists." Marcus nodded. "I understand." Harold looked toward Mercer. "Will anyone lose a career over today?" Mercer paused before answering. "That depends on facts, policies, and decisions made after careful review." Harold folded his hands together. "I hope whatever happens teaches more than it punishes." Marcus looked at his father with quiet admiration. "You still think like a teacher." Harold smiled. "Old habits stay longer than old furniture." Evelyn reached across the table and gently touched Marcus's hand. "Promise me something. Anything. Do not let today make you suspicious of everyone wearing a uniform." Marcus smiled softly. "I could never do that. I have spent my career working beside people who wear one." Evelyn nodded with visible relief. "Good. Bitterness has a way of stealing tomorrow because of what happened yesterday." Mercer quietly looked down into his coffee before speaking again. "Mrs. Brooks, that may be the wisest thing I have heard all week." Outside, the evening sun settled lower behind the oak tree, sending warm golden light through the kitchen window. It rested across the vase of yellow daisies, across Harold's weathered hands, across Evelyn's gentle smile, and across Marcus, who suddenly realized that no badge, no title, and no accomplishment would ever matter more than sitting at this small table surrounded by the people who had taught him what real strength looked like. The evening settled gently over Harold and Evelyn Brooks's home, wrapping the neighborhood in the warm amber glow of porch lights and quiet conversations drifting from nearby yards. Dinner had long since replaced the tension of the afternoon. The soup Marcus had carried home simmered softly on the stove, slices of fresh bread rested in a woven basket at the center of the table, and the yellow daisies stood proudly in their glass vase, catching the last rays of sunlight filtering through the kitchen window. Nothing about the room suggested that only hours earlier strangers had watched this family through phone screens in a grocery store parking lot. Now there was only laughter, the familiar clink of silverware, and the comforting rhythm of people who never needed many words to understand one another. Harold leaned back in his chair and looked toward the framed family photographs lining the wall. "You know," he said quietly, "today reminded me of something I used to tell my students every first day of school." Marcus smiled. "I probably heard it 100 times. Harold chuckled. "Probably more." Evelyn looked at her husband with amused affection. "Go ahead. Tell him again." Harold folded his hands together. "The easiest thing in the world is to judge someone you have not taken the time to know. The hardest thing is admitting you were wrong after you finally do." Silence settled comfortably around the table. Marcus lowered his eyes for a moment, thinking about the parking lot, the flashing lights, the questions, and the quiet patience his parents had carried through every minute of it. "I kept wondering whether I should have told them who I was," he admitted. Evelyn reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "If you had, they would have treated an agent differently." Marcus nodded slowly. "Exactly," she smiled. "Instead, they met a son." Those 4 simple words stayed with him longer than anything else spoken that day. A son, not a title, not a badge, not a government credential. Just a man standing beside his aging parents because that was where he belonged. Special Agent Daniel Mercer finished the last sip of his coffee before quietly standing to leave. Harold walked him to the front door. "Thank you for coming," Harold said warmly. Mercer smiled. "Thank you for reminding me why good people choose public service in the first place." They shook hands before Mercer disappeared into the quiet evening. Marcus stepped onto the front porch a few minutes later. The air had cooled, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and distant rain. Across the street, children rode bicycles beneath streetlights while neighbors waved to one another without knowing anything about what had happened earlier that day. Life had already moved forward. Harold joined his son on the porch swing. For a while they simply listened to the evening insects and watched the oak tree sway gently in the breeze. Finally Harold spoke. "I have always been proud that you became an agent." Marcus looked over at him. Harold smiled softly. "But today I was even prouder that you never needed anyone to know it." Marcus felt the weight of those words settle quietly in his heart. After a long pause, he answered, "You and Mom taught me that respect is something you give before you expect it in return." Harold nodded. "Then I guess your mother and I did one thing right." Marcus laughed. "You did a lot more than one." Inside the house, Evelyn carefully adjusted the vase so the yellow daisies faced the window, where tomorrow morning the first sunlight would reach them again. She looked toward the two men sitting on the porch and smiled to herself. The world outside often measured people by uniforms, appearances, titles, or assumptions. But inside this little house, none of those things mattered. Character had always been enough. As darkness settled completely across the quiet neighborhood, the porch light cast a warm circle across the front steps, while father and son continued their conversation in unhurried voices. No reporters arrived. No headlines appeared. No one celebrated a dramatic victory. There was only a family returning to ordinary life, carrying one extraordinary reminder that dignity should never depend on recognition, kindness should never wait for credentials, and the strongest people are often the ones who choose grace when they have every reason not to. Some stories end with power. This one ended with humanity, and that was always the greater triumph. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Narralight for more powerful stories that remind us to look beyond appearances, challenge prejudice, and never underestimate the impact of doing what's right. Because sometimes, the smallest act of courage creates the biggest change. Thank you for watching. Remember, the world changes one choice at a time. We'll see you in the next story.